It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. We're looking at the aftermath of the U.S. strike on the Assad regime that hit an airfield. Syria says the attack killed 6 people. Russia has now suspended deconfliction efforts with the U.S., seeking to reduce air incidents over Syria in response. Joining us to discuss is Rania Khalek, independent journalist and co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. Rania, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
So tell us your response to what happened yesterday. The reaction in the U.S. media and amongst the U.S. political establishment was one of near universal support. What's your take?
It was absolutely stunning because all of these media outlets that have been for the past several months very anti-Trump, spending every single day bashing Trump for good reason in many cases, suddenly got behind Trump and were just so ecstatic and excited about these airstrikes. You had Brian Williams on MSNBC talking about how these airstrikes were beautiful and quoting Leonard Cohen.
We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these 2 U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
Watching MSNBC of all channels, which is supposed to be, the main anti-Trump channel and the pro-Democratic Party channel, all I saw was people who were in favor of this bombing. I didn't see a single dissenting voice. So it's been really, really stunning to just watch all of these networks and all of these mainstream outlets line up behind Donald Trump. Now suddenly Donald Trump is being embraced by liberals and Democrats across the board, all because he bombed a Syrian government airbase. It's bizarre and really disturbing on a lot of levels.
So, Rania, on the strike itself, what do you think its impact will be on the Syrian conflict?
I don't think it's going to be that dramatic, only because it doesn't seem as though the Trump administration plans to escalate any further. They destroyed a part of this airbase, and it briefly did put the Syrian government forces back a little bit in the advancements they've been making, but it won't be anything significant because I just don't see the U.S. Or any other outside power at this point intervening in a significant fashion to help the opposition. And that's what the opposition desperately needs right now. After losing their base in East Aleppo, they have all of any gains that they had have been completely reversed, and they are basically desperate at this point, and the only thing that can save them is Western military intervention. And so anything short of that on a dramatic scale is just not going to tip the balance at this point.
Okay, which brings up an important point, which is the issue around this attack and who did it. Now, the Assad regime has shown no compunction about attacking its own people. They've killed, I think it's fair to say, the majority of the victims of this conflict. So it's certainly quite believable in my mind that they would do this. On the other hand, just to raise the point of view of the skeptics that it was the Assad regime, as you mentioned, the regime was doing well, supposedly, in this conflict. They had taken Aleppo in recent months. They'd recently made gains against ISIS. And just days earlier, the U.S. had said that they no longer see regime change as a goal in Syria. So what do you make of this issue itself, of whether or not it was the Assad regime that carried out this attack?
Look, the Syrian government is violent. No one's questioning that. But the question is the Syrian government stupid? And like you said, they finally have the U.S. administration saying that we're not focused on regime change. We're focused on ISIS. We're not interested in regime change anymore. And you have the Syrian government winning. They've taken back a lot of territory from this patchwork of Al Qaeda linked rebel groups across the country. And this is on the eve of peace talks that were taking place in Geneva, that this attack in Idlib took place. So there is nothing of strategic value for the government to gain from launching a chemical weapons attack. The scenario that if they did do it, then you're talking about, let's say they were stupid enough to do it. You're talking about the Syrian government having stored away some secret sarin after they had gotten rid of most of their chemical weapons under the cooperation of the international community. And just suddenly, on the eve of these peace talks, after they finally get what they wanted from the US, they decide to launch these chemical weapons in an insignificant, like a militarily insignificant village in Idlib. It just doesn't make sense. And again, maybe they did do it, but the question becomes, okay, where's the evidence? And the fact of the matter is that even Staffan de Mistura, the special envoy from the UN to Syria, said himself after this attack that they've not yet have any reliable confirmation of what took place and who did it. And so until there is some sort of investigation to see who did it, we're not going to know. The problem is that in Idlib, in these areas that are under the control of these armed groups, you don't have any independent sources on the ground for the most part. What you have is, like I mentioned, a patchwork of Al Qaeda linked rebel groups that basically have been implicated in killing human rights workers, in killing journalists, in killing activists. And so the information coming out of these areas are basically a narrative being controlled by the opposition. And again, like I mentioned, the opposition right now is desperate, and they have done this in the past. I mean, this is what insurgencies do, regardless of whether they're linked to Al Qaeda or not. Insurgencies, especially in positions of desperation, they have to try to provoke intervention. So there are a lot of questions and a lot of holes in the sort of narrative we're hearing. And so I think that people should be very skeptical of anything coming out of Syria from either side until there is some sort of independent investigation that takes place.
Just on the issue of being skeptical, the Assad and Russian explanation for this attack is that they say that a regime strike hit a chemical cache of the rebels. But as far as I've seen, there have been no pictures from them showing what this cache is. And Kareem Shaheen, the reporter from The Guardian, he went in and took a picture of what he said was the warehouse that would have stored these chemicals, and it just looked like an empty area with some grain silos. So both sides, as far as I've seen, have yet to produce evidence.
No, exactly. I mean, like I said, when it comes to the issue of Syria, both sides are invested in all kinds of propaganda and trying to sway public opinion to their side. And that's why it's crucial that in these situations, it's important that we be able to have some sort of investigation, some sort of scientific process to determine what actually took place. And the fact of the matter is, in this situation, we may never actually know exactly what took place, because like I said, there are very few, if any, independent observers that are on the ground and able to tell us exactly what's happening in Syria. All the information coming out from either side should be treated with a great deal of skepticism. And what's really shocking about all this is that you have the entire world basically deciding within hours that not only did the Assad regime do this, but then you have the US actually bombing a Syrian airbase based on claims that have yet to be proven. And that's what's really shocking. This is serious stuff we're talking about. And just to add to that, the US bombed a base that's near Homs that is actually used to fight ISIS. And immediately after the US sent cruise missiles to destroy this base, what you had was ISIS launching offensive operations against the Syrian army in areas around Homs. So essentially, the US provided ISIS with air cover yesterday. And that's what's really dangerous about the situation in Syria, is as convoluted and complex as it is, you do have the Syrian army is the most organized force that is able, and as we speak, fighting groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. You can argue about how they're doing it, just like you can argue about how the U.S. is fighting these, ISIS in Iraq, which has been very violent as well. But by default, when you attack the Syrian army, you are essentially helping ISIS and helping Al Qaeda.
Okay, so this raises a very important point. Assad has taken on ISIS with increasing frequency. There was the victory against them in Palmyra last year, and in recent weeks in the north, they've made some gains against ISIS. But what do you say to a Syrian who's living in an area that's been under regime bombardment, that is not ISIS controlled, and that is simply just populated by civilians who've been under brutal assault by Assad, who would welcome any strike that would target his warplanes, that would ground them, because that could potentially save their lives because they've been under such assault from Assad's forces?
I mean, look, you have the same situation in Mosul right now. You have civilians in Mosul. I mean, it's awful. It's horrific what's taking place in all of these areas. The fact of the matter is that these areas are occupied by insurgent groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, and groups that behave just and have the same ideology as Al Qaeda. So when we're talking about Syrians in these areas, it's terrible for civilians who are trapped in these areas, because not only do they have to deal with bombardment from the sky, they also have to deal with these groups that are controlling their areas on the ground, that have, in all of these areas. I mean, they've banned music, they've banned, women can be stoned. They have basically forcibly converted or killed minorities. In Idlib in particular, the Druze minority in Idlib had been forcibly converted, tens of thousands of people, or killed. Christians in Idlib, Christian families, have been chased out. In some cases, people were kidnapped and ransomed. And I've talked to Syrians who still don't know what happened to their families because they couldn't afford to pay the ransoms for their family members. So it goes beyond just bombardment. I mean, the horrors that people in these places are living in, they're living under these insane cultish style Salafi jihadist groups, and the threat of bombardment from above. And so I don't know what you say to them. I think that what this comes down to is that whether we're talking about in Syria, in places like Aleppo or Idlib, or whether we're talking about in Iraq, whether it's Mosul or Ramadi, which areas, these places have been, just like East Aleppo, have been completely destroyed by U.S. airstrikes and Iraqi forces. So I think this actually goes to counterterrorism operations and how those work. The problem is with counterterrorism, and that's what we've seen regimes in the Middle East adopt against areas that are occupied by these groups. They're basically just adopting the American, the American style of dealing with insurgencies. And so I think that's the real question we have to ask, is that what do you do when ISIS or Al Qaeda or Ahrar al-Sham has taken over areas, different parts of the Middle East? And so I don't know what you do. I don't have the answer to that, but I don't think what the Syrian government, what the Russians and what the Americans and Iraqis have been doing, I don't think it's right.
Rania Khalek, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be on with you, Aaron.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.